Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Friday, everybody. I hope you've had a productive week, and I wish you a restful weekend ahead. Speaking of the weekend, there will be no China Update video tomorrow, Saturday, but I will make up for this by providing you with an episode on Sunday. Today's video will focus primarily on overcapacity, industrial policy, and the resulting trade and geopolitical frictions from this in China. Let's begin with US-China relations. Treasury Secretary Yellen has arrived in China, where she will spend the next several days. Yellen is the first member of Biden's cabinet to travel to China twice. Once viewed as a more dovish voice in the administration, Yellen's comments ahead of the trip have hardened somewhat, with accusations of Chinese overcapacity front and center. In meetings in Guangzhou and Beijing, Yellen is expected to tell her Chinese counterparts to stop relying on exports to prop up their underperforming economy and instead boost their own consumer market. Speaking to US-based The Wall Street Journal on Wednesday before the trip, Yellen expressed that a cascade of inexpensive Chinese clean energy goods is driving down prices on global markets, threatening to snuff out American efforts to nurture a domestic clean energy industry. Quote, "We don't want to be overly dependent and they want to dominate the market. We're not going to let that happen," end quote. The Wall Street Journal piece observed that this message will also mark an evolution for Yellen herself and the end of a bygone era in US economic thinking about China. Like other economists of her generation, Yellen, 77 years old, said the surge in Chinese exports at the start of the 21st century had seemed like a positive development, providing low-cost goods to global consumers. In a separate interview this week, Yellen expressed now, however, quote, "China's overcapacity distorts global prices and production patterns," end quote. In anticipation of this trip, Beijing on Tuesday firmly rejected the United States' accusation of implementing non-market trade policies and practices, as well as setting barriers such as agricultural products and data policies. Li Yong, a senior research fellow at the China Association of International Trade, speaking to state media yesterday, expressed, quote, "The US should view China's capacity issue from an objective point of view, as China's production capacity is determined by global market demand, its efficiency and the scale of its vast domestic market. To label it as overcapacity would be to stray from facts, if not an ill-intended campaign to smear China following the de-risking theory," end quote. With the US and the EU both pushing overcapacity concerns with Beijing, this topic has become an area of intense debate in Western policy circles. US outlet Bloomberg, for example, writes this week that a look at the data suggests that while China does have widespread industrial overcapacity, quote, "much of this is driven by industries that Western nations don't compete with China on, such as low-tech goods and those related to the nation's property slump, from cement to furniture," end quote. However, US-based Rhodium Group, in a recent report called Overcapacity at the Gate, pointed out that the National People's Congress in China concluded in March this year with an explicit focus on industrial policy favoring high-technology industries and very little fiscal support for household consumption. This policy mix, the Rhodium Group report argues, will compound the growing imbalance between domestic supply and demand. Systemic bias towards supporting producers rather than households or consumers allows Chinese firms to ramp up production despite low margins, without the fear of bankruptcy that constrains firms in market economies. So far, it continues, policymakers in Brussels and other advanced economies have mostly fretted over excess capacity in clean technology sectors, including electric vehicles, solar modules, and wind turbines, which have already seen supply and demand imbalances in China for years. However, quote, "indications of rapid production expansion across many more sectors have emerged since 2021, as Beijing sought to boost growth with supply-side policies during and after the pandemic. The situation underscores a systemic problem, not confined to specific sectors, which will set China on course for a trade confrontation with the rest of the world," end quote. We will return to this theme later in the video. Yellen kicked off her trip today, Friday morning, with a meeting to hear the concerns of American, European and Japanese business representatives in the southern megacity of Guangzhou, also known as Canton in English. After that, she met with Wang Weizhong, governor of the province of Guangdong, where she called for a, quote, "level playing field for American workers and firms. This includes the issue of China's industrial overcapacity, which the US and other countries are concerned can cause global spillovers," End quote. Next up, are Tesla's best days in China behind them? The global slowdown in electric vehicle demand that contributed to Tesla Inc.'s biggest ever quarterly sales miss is especially pronounced in China, the world's biggest EV market. Tesla's market share shrank to around 6.7% for the quarter ending in December, from 10.5% in the first quarter of last year, according to China's Passenger Car Association data. And China's car makers have proven willing to join the price war Tesla kicked off in late 2022. However, then on Monday this week, BYD reported a 42% fall in its electric vehicle deliveries in the first 3 months of the year compared to the first quarter of 2023, allowing Tesla to reclaim the crown as the world's largest seller of electric vehicles. The Chinese EV company overtook Tesla in EV sales during the first quarter of 2023, when it shifted 526,000 electric vehicles compared to 484,000 sold by Tesla between October and December. On Tuesday this week, though, we learned that Tesla posted sales of 386,000 vehicles in the first 3 months of this year, below the expected 450,000, but more than that of its Chinese rival, which sold 300,000 battery-only vehicles in the March quarter. BYD plans to launch its first electrified pickup truck for the global market later this year. Now, demand is softening across the board, and the price war wages on. On Monday this week, Chinese electric vehicle maker NIO Inc. announced a subsidy program totaling 1 billion yuan, $138 million, to lure traditional gasoline vehicle owners to buy its models. Starting April 1st, people who replace their fossil fuel cars with new Neon models will receive up to 10,000 yuan, $1,300 in subsidies that can be spent on optional interior parts and accessories. This week too, China's central bank and major financial regulator said loan ratios for gasoline and electric vehicles, including hybrids, can now be independently determined by leading institutions. A notice issued Wednesday allows financial institutions to extend loans covering up to 100% of the purchase price for both traditional and new electric vehicles, based on the purchaser's creditworthiness. The shift towards full loan coverage represents a significant policy change from the 2017 caps, which limited financing to 80% for traditional vehicles and 85% for new energy vehicles. Quote, "There are only two ways to increase the consumption share of GDP. The sustainable way is to increase the household share of GDP. The unsustainable way is to reduce household savings or, what is the same thing, to increase household or fiscal debt. Beijing seems to be choosing two ways of boosting household debt. Allowing car purchases with no money down may well boost car sales in the short term, or at least accelerate them. But I wonder if it will ultimately come at the expense of bank balance sheets." End quote. As the old Thomas Sowell observation goes, there are very rarely solutions, only trade-offs. Next up, China's economic collision course. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing all helps for the channel. And for anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is a lot of work, but all your support are all incredible sources of motivation. So thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, to end today's video, I wanted to examine a widely read piece published this week in US-based Foreign Affairs from two leading China finance experts. Daniel H. Rosen is a founding partner of Rhodium Group and leads the firm's work on Asia, and Logan Wright is a partner at Rhodium Group who leads the firm's research on China's financial markets. The piece is called China's Economic Collision Course. As growth slows, Beijing's moves are drawing a global backlash. It touches on themes from the beginning of today's video, which we have been following closely on China Update for some time. We now quote selected excerpts from the piece directly. China's economy has barely grown in the past 2 years. The immediate causes, including a decline in property construction and ham-fisted zero-COVID policies that tanked private sector investment, are well known, but the roots of this stagnation are systemic, and firms and analysts inside China, as well as governments and businesses around the world, have waited with anticipation for Beijing to clarify its plans to put the country's economy on a more stable track. Between 2010 and 2019, not long ago, China's annual GDP growth averaged 7.7%, but today the basic policy reforms necessary to support even 3 or 4% growth are proving difficult for Beijing to achieve. China has run an annual trade surplus for more than 2 decades,
But in 2022 and 2023, a slowdown in China's domestic demand pushed the country's exports to exceed its imports by a shocking $1.7 trillion. After over 2 decades of strong investment-led growth, China now needs consumption-led growth. Further investment will have diminishing returns unless China can consume more at home. Yet over the past 2 years, the opposite has happened. Unable to sell goods to domestic buyers, Chinese companies are exporting their excess production abroad. The United States, the European Union, Japan, and other advanced and developing countries worry that this trend will continue, that China is preparing to export its way out of the economic slowdown. Beijing has declined to prioritize domestic demand and openly denigrated consumer stimulus proposals, and it has promised to sustain support for the very industries that are driving China's export growth. These policies will result in larger Chinese trade surpluses and foreign deficits, undercutting competition abroad and threatening to put Western firms out of business and their workers out of jobs. Faced with an economic situation that calls for structural reforms to enhance productivity and bring domestic demand more in line with production, Chinese leaders have instead put forward a policy mix that will delay necessary changes and deepen the economy's reliance on foreign sources of demand. To protect their own economies from the damage caused by inexpensive Chinese exports, foreign governments will increasingly turn to anti-dumping tools, which typically include tariffs on Chinese goods produced below cost. Worsening trade conflict is an inevitable outcome of current Chinese policies and will not be limited to China's relationships with advanced economies. Trade disputes are already arising between Beijing and several other members of the multilateral forum known as BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Earlier this month, Brazil initiated anti-dumping investigations into Chinese steel imports. India has introduced more anti-dumping orders than any country in the world in its efforts to restrict imports from China. South Africa's Trade Commission recently completed an assessment of Chinese imports and confirmed that dumping was taking place. Defense spending is also set to rise much faster than overall government spending or revenue generation. China has planned for only a 4% increase in total expenditures, but it has mapped out a 7.2% expansion for its defense budget. The signal to the rest of the world is that Beijing is prepared to prioritize its military over investments in sustainable household development or human capital. Not only does Beijing appear unwilling to address domestic economic imbalances, but it may also lack the capacity to do so. This is especially concerning. But China is now poorly positioned to engineer such a shift. The state collects only around 14% of GDP in tax revenues, well below the Organization of Economic Cooperation Development average of 34%. More important, a large part of these revenues comes from value-added taxes on manufacturing and other taxes on businesses rather than taxes on individual income and domestic consumption. Under the current tax system, therefore, a transition to a consumption-led economy would result in a dramatic decrease in tax revenues, undercutting Beijing's ability to execute policy. Chinese officials often say that Beijing does not deliberately seek a trade surplus. Deliberate or not, China's trade imbalances are not sustainable for the rest of the world, and China should not be surprised if foreign governments start to respond more aggressively. Tariff hikes on Chinese imports may only provide temporary relief. With few effective policy options and an unwilling negotiator in Beijing, Western governments in particular will consider increasingly draconian restrictions on Chinese trade. That shock may be what is necessary for China to take structural reforms seriously, for the sake of its own economic health, and in the hope of avoiding an irreparable split in global trade. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Let me know your thoughts on today's episode in the comments below. I am particularly interested in your thoughts on this final piece in Foreign Affairs by the two Rhodium Group authors. That is today's episode of China Update. Have a good Friday, have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all on Sunday.